Hey everybody, my name is Jonathan Freeman. Someone else's name is Chris Auber, and the two of us make a podcast which you are listening to called Hell If We Know. For those of you that have listened to previous episodes, I will admit this is a slightly different episode than our usual stuff. For one thing, you may have noticed by now that our general modus operandus is to come up with a topic and then mostly ignore that topic and just talk about random dumb stuff for 90% of the episode. With this one, we actually did cover a number of different stories and concepts that all fit one overarching theme. It was a much more mature and productive conversation than we usually have, which is kind of cool. Sort of going with that, it is a slightly less silly episode than we usually do. Not at a complete lack for silliness, but certainly relative to our usual stuff. But I like that. I think it's one of my favorite episodes so far, which I know I've said before. But I think, and you will probably agree, that it more than makes up with that lack of silliness, or relative lack of silliness, with an absolute surplus of insight and interestingness and goodness. And that is due in large part to the wonderful guest we had on the show named Sister Tracey, and she's a friend of mine and an excellent person, and you will learn why she's an excellent person as you listen to the episode. But yeah, so it's a different episode than usual, but it's worth it. So if you are my mom playing solitaire while you listen to this, which statistically, if we look at a demographic map of our listeners, there's a very high percentage chance that you are my mom playing solitaire right now, I recommend you turn off the solitaire or pause it or whatever you do. I don't know really how it works. And listen to this because there's good stuff in it and I think you'll enjoy it.
I think it would be. I think to, I mean, so you're a nun, right?
Yeah, interesting question because I'm technically a sister. This is a common misconception.
Okay.
There's actually a difference between a sister and a nun.
Ooh, lay it on
technically, me. Right. Technically, the term nun refers to people who are in more contemplative or cloistered communities who don't leave the grounds of the convent, or some monastic communities will use that term. Okay. But a sister is like, we would take the same vows, but it's more of the term for apostolic communities. So like I leave this house, like I go out and I do a ministry and in the community, and yeah, so that's kind of the major difference. But it's funny to me when sometimes I just let it go because they're like, oh, nun, right, sister act, like I get it, like that they get the context of what it means, and it's not worth the whole like lengthy explanation. But people that I'm like, friends with and stuff, when I was joining the Catholic worker community in Indianapolis, I had this long conversation with my friend Stuart because he kept saying like, oh my gosh, you're going to be a nun. And I was like, no, Stuart, I'm going to be a sister. And so we would argue about it. And he got me as a gift for Christmas, he got me this shirt made that said, I'm not a nun, I'm a sister. And he was just so proud of himself.
That is one of those shirts that is going to be funny to about 1% of the population. And to that 1%, it will be legitimately funny. And to nobody else.
Yep.
That's how you know your people, though.
That's right. If somebody comments on your shirt, you know then that they are, them's the ones.
Right, yep. And it's an educational tool. I mean, I wear it around the house, and the sisters think it's funny, so.
Yeah. Do you live in a house with other sisters?
Yeah, so there are 5 of us who live in this house. And I'm the newest addition, so our community, owns this house, and so the 5 of us together, we have regular times each week that we share meals and prayer, and we're all Sisters of Providence. It's interesting because apart from me, the other 4 range in age from 67 to 84.
Wow.
So
wait,
I bring down
you're way the youngest.
Yeah, way, yeah.
Wow.
So I bring down our average a solid couple decades or so. But yeah, it's cool though because, these are sisters who have lived in intentional community their whole lives, and I learn a lot from them. But there's also some significant generational gaps, things that are funny to me.
You have to help them sync their iPad and things like that.
Right. Actually, yes, that just happened last night.
Why can't I get my daily Bible verse to pop up every morning?
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Is what I imagine a 21st century nun would say.
Yes.
Sister.
Absolutely.
No, sorry, sister.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
I'm
got
just
it.
learning
You
the
got
difference
it.
too.
This is
My bad.
good.
Or like I have to explain, like there have been times that like the phone rings and a sister answers it and it's one of those scams. And they're like, yeah. And they're like, you know, they get off the phone and I'm like, who was that you were just giving your social security number to?
Oh, no.
And it's like, oh, well, they knew that I was having computer problems. So, like, I knew it was legit.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, you do realize everyone has computer problems. So, you know, just those different things. But they also share, like, their stories about the crazy things in the history of our community that happened and, like, all the pranks that they played when they were novices and stuff. So that's pretty fun.
Wow, that sounds like you guys have a good sisterhood then.
Yeah.
So, for people listening, this is Sister Tracey.
Hello.
She's friend of the show. That doesn't really exist yet, but potentially friend when it becomes a real show. Friend of mine, great person, and we've got some introductory questions for her.
Yay.
Favorite ice
So,
cream
question
topping?
number 1.
Really?
No, they're not that shallow,
Okay.
but you can
Okay.
answer if you want.
Let's see. I think my favorite ice cream topping is more ice cream.
Ah, all right.
Because
This is good.
There's actually nothing better than ice cream. I think when you add stuff to it, it actually dilutes the power of the ice cream.
Wow.
That's profound. You're not like a Jimmy's person at all.
No, yeah.
You call them Jimmy's?
I did just now. I'm working on transitioning to that because I kind of like it. It's more fun to say than sprinkles phonetically. That like I just 1 minute ago, I made the decision in my head. Now on, I'm gonna say Jimmy's.
So
Where does
was
that
my
come
first
from?
time.
Is there a person named Jimmy?
I was gonna
who,
say
like-
I picture a bunch of little boys on top of your ice cream.
Oh, that's not great.
That's really strange.
I might
Yeah.
go back. I had a good run with Jimmy's.
Do you want to hit him with the real first question?
Okay.
Yeah. So question number 2, what is your religious or spiritual background? And also feel free to answer these however you want.
Yeah.
All of them.
Okay, so I grew up Roman Catholic. I'm actually learning more to say Roman Catholic because I've been hanging out with a lot of Episcopals, and they're like, yeah, I'm Catholic too, and I didn't realize that like that term was used so broadly, so that's kind of interesting. So yeah, I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, born and raised one of those cradle Catholics, and you know, I remember going to Mass every Sunday with my family, and I actually thought, like, everybody was white and Catholic growing up because that was, like, our circle of people that we knew. And, yeah, it was really something that was part of our extended, you know, lives. It wasn't just Sunday. It was, you know, we would pray the rosary together at night as a family and pray before meals. And so when you think of all the sort of stereotypical Catholic cultural traditions. Yeah, I grew up in all of that.
That's kind of a... So you said your circle of people growing up was all white Catholic people.
Yeah.
And mine wasn't all white people, but it was... I remember the first time that I figured out everyone wasn't Catholic, or everyone wasn't even Christian. I was really, really surprised. Of course... Obviously now 23-year-old Chris thinks, of course there can be other religions. Of course that's a thing that happens around the world. Mm-hmm. But I was probably only 6 or 7, and I realized that not everybody believed in God and not everybody was Christian, and I was just blown away by that. And so I think it's totally weird that it takes so long for people to realize.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
that,
no,
you know,
I agree.
Not everybody's like that.
Right. I had a moment, I actually can distinctly remember a moment like in the sandbox in our backyard, and our next door neighbors would come over and play with us a lot, and I don't remember how it came up, but 6-year-old Tracey said something about Jesus, and they're like, who's that? And I was like, what? Doesn't everybody know who Jesus is? And so then I went into my little childhood self, like evangelizing to them and teaching them about like he died on the cross and this is what happened, and you know, like telling all the stories. And I do remember though, like the shock of that these people who were my next door neighbors that we played with every day, like I just had this assumption that like, don't you go to church on Sunday like we do? And I came to find out that their family, they didn't really have any faith tradition that they associated with, and I had a really hard time like understanding that and like associating that in my brain and figuring out what that meant.
It's funny that you were in the sandbox with your neighbor when that happened, because I remember that experience for me. I was on top of the slide about to go down with my next door neighbor. And
so did you still go down the slide, or did you like stay at the top and have the conversation?
I went down the slide. Let's not get this wrong. But I was surprised the entire time that I went down the slide.
It wasn't as fun as usual. You came down that slide a different man.
It was like a metaphorical slide.
I climbed up that ladder. One man or a boy, and I slid down a man.
Wow, that's profound.
But yeah, you think about like object permanence and like psychological development. You're like 2 or 3, I think, when you even learn that things exist after you stop looking at them.
Right.
So the idea of like things exist that you don't even know about.
Yeah.
Like it kind of like we're like, wow, how did it take us that long? But it kind of makes sense. Question number 3. What is your relationship to or understanding of the Christian Bible?
Yeah, so when you say Christian Bible, then are you talking about Christian scriptures, which would be just the New Testament, or are we talking the whole Judeo-Christian?
Right, Judeo-Christian.
Okay, gotcha.
And specifically canonical, I guess.
Oh, yeah. So in my understanding of the Catholic teaching, which I've found is different, again, than what other people believe, is that, I believe that scriptures are divinely inspired, but it's also like in a context. So I don't, I say I and we, like as Catholics, don't take the scriptures totally literally, but like understand like it happened in a certain place in time, and that the meaning that it had at that time is not the meaning that it would have today. And I think like probably within the past 5 years, the piece of scriptures that has been most informative to my ministry and who I am is this sense that Jesus was actually offending and deconstructing the empire. And I don't think I definitely didn't grow up like understanding that or thinking that.
Right. He was the rebel.
Yeah.
He was not the good guy.
Right.
During his time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a few years ago, I read the book, actually, Jesus the Rebel. And I can't think right now of who the author is, but it's somebody I really admire, and I'm really embarrassed that I can't remember his name. But it's interesting because it goes through, I think Jonathan's looking it up right now. Yeah. It goes through like the Gospels and some of the key stories and interprets how Jesus was actually totally dismantling the status quo. And I just think that's so interesting because growing up, like I was totally unaware of that. And we didn't exactly have priests that would homilize about those kinds of things. But
is homilize a word?
It is now. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
But we can say that it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll accept it.
Right. Yeah. So I think that I'm definitely growing in my understanding and relationship to Scripture, because I think I've gone through some phases of like when I was young, it didn't really, it was more about the rituals and about a personal relationship with God, and God loves me, and then like growing up, then it was more like, let's study different parts of scriptures and, what was the context, and getting a little bit more of the history. And now it's like delving even more into like the person of Jesus in that time, and recognizing that like, oh my gosh, like he was a rule breaker. And this is not something that I knew growing up. So it's been really interesting. Did you get the...
Yeah, John Deere?
Yes, John Deere. So I would definitely recommend...
the tractor guy.
Yeah.
Tractor? Oh, yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So, John
he had a busy life, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, he did a lot.
Writing books, making tractors.
So many things.
Yeah.
All 2 of those things.
Yeah.
He's still living. He's a really interesting character. But, I guess now I see Scripture and, the life of Jesus in particular as being this amazing tool for liberation. And I think, too, I've seen, like, learning a little bit. I'm not a theologian by any means, but just having some cursory... What?
I was just saying, everyone's a theologian.
Yeah, that's true.
You think about God.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point.
Sorry to interrupt.
I'm not a credentialed theologian, I would say. So anyway, all of that to say that, like, I've definitely had a developing understanding and relationship to Scripture that previously it was something that was kind of vague and I didn't really focus on. But now, understanding a little bit more Jesus as a person. And we talk a lot at IndieCan the organization that I have my ministry at. Juward is an organizer on our staff, and I just always hear him talking about Jesus as this dark-skinned Palestinian man, and like that is in very significant contrast to like the white European Jesus that I, grew up seeing pictures of. So it's definitely like an evolving relationship and understanding for me.
So you're a constant gardener of your faith.
I guess you could say that.
That's beautiful.
I actually have like a little garden outside. I don't know how you knew that. It's kind of creepy.
Well, it's because it's because of Jonathan, transition. I don't know.
So I was gonna say, it's interesting you point out like how it's developed and stuff. Actually, I'm so ready for this transition. There's one of my friends at work. He's the type. He describes it in his own words as like he spent his first 40 years just absorbing and listening, and now he just won't stop talking about everything he's absorbed. So I'll just like step in my cubicle sometimes and start going on spiels about his ideas, and they're cool ideas, so I like it. And it's like another 2 hours where I'm not working, so that's cool too. But he told me one time about how he looks at Jesus' story and everything, how it's a constant act of subversion, both in terms of like politically and with the Roman government at that time, but also in terms of just like the people who interacted with him, their expectations of like how Jesus would handle a situation. It was never ever what they would, even when it seemed logical, like the whole using your perfume on his feet thing, and like the what's her face comes in and is like, hey, we could have sold that and helped the poor. Jesus was like, nah, put perfume on my feet. And so the constant sort of like, whenever you think you've got theology or Christianity or Christ pegged down, there's always that idea that you really don't, and there's always room to grow.
Oh yeah.
And that's a big part of Reformed theology, which is my thing too, even though I don't know a lot about it. So that's cool, just to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Well, and I also have started to like explore this idea of Jesus as a community organizer, and maybe that's just like egotistical because I am a community organizer and I want Jesus to be like me. Right. But it's
it is
really
a very Christly like position.
Right.
Like, I'm kind of with that. I see Jesus as a community organizer too.
Yeah, because like to think about, so there were like Jesus asked like over 300 questions. If you're just looking at the scriptures, the stuff that was actually like written down and recorded. And he was like constantly asking questions. And if you look at the questions that were asked of him, it's like 187 questions asked of him. And he only answered like 3 of them, like literally only 3, which I think is so interesting because it's like, it wasn't like he had all the answers and he was about like lecturing. It was inviting people into exploration of like what the empire was and who God is. And I mean, we were actually just talking yesterday about the scripture of the man who was at the side of the pool, and Jesus came up. He'd been there for like 38 years or something, just sitting there, and had never made his way into the pool. And Jesus came up and he was like, they were just, chatting. He was like, I've been sitting here 38 years and I've never gotten in this pool. And Jesus is like, do you want to be healed? Like, ask the question. And he could have just picked him up and put him in or just healed him. And eventually he did, but he was like, I'm not going to let you get away with believing that you don't have the power to choose your own destiny. So I just think that's it. Go, Chris.
Oh, it's interesting that I never knew that Jesus asked more questions than he answered. I knew that Jesus was notorious for never answering questions, and I think that's something that if he were alive today would infuriate me, because if I had a professor who, when I raised my hand and asked a question, he was like, well, class, this is the perfect opportunity for me to sit you all down and tell you a story about a guy who you don't know in a land far away solving a problem that is somewhat metaphorically like yours, but it's up to you to figure it out. I would be so infuriated if that was my professor and he answered questions like that, or sort of, it seems to me, like skirted around the answer like that.
Right.
But so it's so interesting that not only did he not answer a lot of questions, but he asked more questions than he answered. Yep. And so he really put the onus on his followers and the people listening to him to do the research themselves. He wasn't there as the answer giver. He was there as the one to make us think about who we are and what we're doing here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which probably did piss a lot of people off. Like, if we're being honest, it actually did. Like,
we know it did because they killed him.
He was crucified. So yeah, I mean, but for the people who were like yearning to grow into their own power and possibility. Like, that's exactly what they needed. So what do you two think? Do you think, like, do you see Jesus as a community organizer? Like, do you have any pushback on that? There's a lot of debate in the community organizer world about whether that's a legitimate assumption or not.
I'm all in on that. As soon as you said that, as soon as I found out what community organizing was, I was like, oh, that's so cool. That's very Jesus-y. So
to me, he sounds like a community organizer who doesn't have any of the credentials that the local government requires of him. Like, if Jesus were in Parks and Recs, he would be the guy who, like, he didn't get all the proper permits to, like, dig a huge hole. And so, like, the hole, hurt a bunch of people, and then, like, the government got mad at him. But he's like, no, it's okay, because this guy learned a lesson when he fell into the hole. And he would come up with some elaborate scheme speech about how, like, it was actually the hole that he dug illegally was actually good for the community, and many people would believe him and follow him. But the local government would be like, we should put you on a cross and stick you with sticks.
That's hilarious,
Just
because
like
I love Parks and Rec. I was actually just watching it last night. There are so many good things. And, like, having interacted a lot recently with local government, there's so much truth. it's really sad, actually, how much accuracy exists there. But, like, the other story that comes to mind for me is, like, when you think about the feeding of the 5,000, and, like, the different translations, it's a little different. But in one of them, it talks about how Jesus actually, well, first of all, like, this kid comes forward with his 5 loaves and 2 fish, and or maybe it's the opposite. Anyway, he's got food, and he brings it, and that's like what starts everything. So because this kid's, like, willing to bring what he has, and then Jesus actually, he blesses the bread and the fish, but then he gives it to the apostles to be the ones to actually distribute it. And so again, it's like just these, like, little nuanced pieces of the story where, Jesus could have been like, all right, I'm going to just create a bunch of food and here it is. But it actually, he did it in a way that required people to, like, step up and to be the creators of their own destiny. And it's interesting because you can see the indignance of the apostles of being like, where are we going to get food for all these people? And Jesus, like, feed them yourselves. Like,
calm down.
You can kind of hear his annoyance of, like, do you people not get it? Like, we have everything that we need right here, and you're just, like, totally missing the point.
I think many people would agree that Jesus is maybe the greatest teacher to ever have existed. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've learned studying teaching in my university and now being a teacher for 4 months-ish is that the best way for the people you're teaching to learn, i.e. Jesus' followers, and in my case, my students, is to get them to practice the learning and to practice the teaching themselves, not just to, be the Sermon on the Mount and be, like, speaking to a bunch of people and have them just listen to you. They have to do it themselves. They have to act on what you've said instead of just passively hearing it, because then, it goes in one ear and out the other, and you may retain some of it, but that's not great teaching. Mm-hmm. Well, Jonathan, do you want to pose our main talking point of today?
And do you want to talk a little bit more about, like, what IndyCan does and what community organizing is? Because I'm sure a lot of the listeners don't know community organizing. Yeah,
so I'm a community organizer with Indianapolis Congregation Action Network, and we are a movement for racial and economic justice. And it's about empowering and engaging leaders in our churches to make changes within the system. So, like, in the Catholic realm, we talk about the 2 feet of justice. So there's, like, the charity foot, which is direct service, like, handing someone food or clothing, meeting direct needs. And then there's the social justice foot, which is about, like, going upriver and figuring out why the babies are being put in the water in the first place. So the focus is on, like, recognizing that people who are directly impacted have tools and power and voices and stories that can make dramatic change in the systems. And just my role is kind of to facilitate that, bring people together and help them do the strategic thinking and encountering the systems and the empire in ways that can make real change happen.
Nice.
That sounds great.
It is great.
I like the Old Testament reference there.
Yeah,
that was neat. So you're the guest, did you have a specific direction you wanted to, like a passage or anything? I've got backups prepared, but I wanted to open that for you.
Yeah, the one thing that had come to my mind was this idea about Jesus as a community organizer. We kind of already talked about that. And I'd be happy to like delve into that more, but I'd be interested in where you would want to take it as well.
Yeah, I think definitely there could be lots of tie-ins between the two, but I was thinking specifically we've usually based it on like Bible passages before, and that's not like the rule, that's just what we've done. So I was looking at the render unto Caesar bit, and talking about how the interplay of that and how we look at, Christian nationalism in the U.S., how we look at separation of church and state and balancing that with faithful practicality and everything. But I mean, we can go all over the place.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that's a great starting point, especially for me, my context is like most of the churches that I work with most directly are Roman Catholic churches. And you do sort of encounter, I think people are really struggling with understanding what level of political involvement is acceptable or is helpful or is something that like we're called to do as people of faith. And there's like I've seen a whole different range of people and how they feel, and I've been personally influenced by my own religious community that is sort of founded in this empowerment and experience of being foreigners in a foreign land, and so that kind of I have a certain bias, you might say, just from that, but people really struggle, and I almost experience like this idea of separation of church and state as like what people do when they feel like they don't know what else to do, or when they feel like it's almost like an excuse for not recognizing the ways that we are actually contributing to a system that's creating a lot of damage. I don't know, what do you think of when you think of like the separation of church and state that's been like historically a part of who we are? Do you see that in like a lot of the people of faith you interact with?
Oh yeah. There's I don't know, and it's one of those things that's been on my mind more recently too, like in the last couple of years, because as a child, I was never involved politically or like spiritually on any really deep level, but as someone who hopes to make some kind of difference in the world someday, even in a small level, which I think everyone wants that, there's got to be a level of political involvement to that, just because of the way our world is set up. And I mean, you can affect one person's life, and that's going to make a world of a difference. But I mean, in the world that we're in right now, there's a lot of political things going on that matter a lot. And that's one of the things I like, specifically talking about tying that in and the render unto Caesar. Like, if you look at that passage, there's a bit, he asked them to pull out a coin and says whose face is on that coin, and it's Caesar's face, and he's like, okay, render that to Caesar's. And what that makes me think of now, and I never would have thought of this like 5 years ago, but if you look at that idea of like whose image does that coin bear, then that makes it Caesar. And if you look at humanity as bearing the image of God, that almost makes it seem like, sure, like the things that don't matter. What matters to God isn't the money or isn't the whatever, obviously. But if you talk about the things that bear that image of God, the humans, I think the money matters only insofar as much it affects human lives. Politics matter insofar as it affects the individuals that we're here to care for and to love.
So it's interesting because I could see people using that scripture to say, things like, I mean, specifically it's referencing taxes, right? And it's interesting for me because Pope Francis has been really clear that there is a moral imperative to be politically involved. And he's actually talked about political involvement as the highest form of charity, which I don't think I've ever heard a pope say that. But because it's directly impacting people's lives and their ability to live a fulfilling life and to thrive. So, I don't know the historical, like, I'd be curious to look more into that scripture and just what was the context around that. And it's almost like I wonder if Jesus might have been inciting this, like, alternative form of economy. Like, okay, this was created by this dominant structure and it has his face on it, so we'll let him have that piece, but like, what is it that we can create outside of that would be of God and wouldn't fit into that other structure. Yeah, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I do think like it's a really deep struggle for people of faith right now, to figure out what, it's almost like we want to draw this line in the sand about what's acceptable, and it's always easier for people if there's a really clear, like I can get involved up to this point, and then it's not my place anymore. And I've actually had conversations with my own family members, particularly when I was in the first parts of my formation, about, there are certain times when people want the church and state separation and certain times when they don't. So I've observed in my own relatives that like when it comes to hospitals and there's this whole like campaign around religious freedom and, making sure that our private hospitals don't have to provide contraception, those kinds of things. So in that way, it's almost like people want their beliefs to be written out into law. But then when other things happen, like we're talking about tax reform or something that would actually directly impact a lot of poor people, they're like, oh, well, like church and state are supposed to be separate. Right. And so it's really, to me, it's like, you can't have it both ways. Like, what's it going to be? So like when it's convenient, we want to separate church and state. But when it actually means that we're going to have to make a choice that's going to impact people's lives, we're like, oh no, so that's been interesting for me to just observe. And actually, recently I had a conversation with someone in our community who runs our missions advancement, and she said, I just want to let you know that we had one of our donors asked to have their name taken off our list because of all the press that you've gotten, and because they see you as a political activist and they think that's inappropriate. So her response was, she said, I actually wanted to tell them that I'm pretty sure Jesus was a political activist, but I don't think that they would have heard that. So I think there's there's a lot of tension around that issue right now, and people don't quite know what to do with it. But I also notice that people are willing to jump into the political arena for some things, but not for others. Mm-hmm. So I just see that whole issue as being kind of hypocritical, that that people, there is that contrast of when people are ready to give something back to Caesar, or when they're like, oh no, like actually we need those coins, so that's kind of just talking in circles. But I think there's just a lot of tension. Yeah, there's just a lot of tension around people now.
Yeah. And the church is no stranger to hypocrisy. So
yes.
We're not like opening any windows to truth
new.
Right now. There's a low awareness of this. But it's interesting, you talk about there's times when you're willing to jump in, times when you're not, and then for sure that's the case. But I don't know, like that's one thing I'm trying to grapple with, I guess, a little bit, is like what's the factor there that determines that? Why are people at times, willing to intervene on behalf of their faith and their convictions, and why are people at times completely unconvicted or not willing to act on behalf of those convictions? Yeah,
I think a lot of it has to do with the human hierarchy of value that we've created within our own church. That some lives we've decided are worth being there for, and some lives we haven't decided yet if they're actually worthy. So, there's, within the Catholic Church, we see this huge Right to Life campaign that's focused on babies. And, when you think of an infant, it's super easy to say, they're innocent. They haven't done anything wrong yet. There's absolutely nothing we could say to condemn an innocent baby, right? So it's kind of easy to jump on that. But then when you talk about other things like capital punishment or immigration, those are people who, it's possible, might have done something wrong in their lives. It's possible might have made a choice that some could judge as the wrong choice, or they might have actually taken someone's life. So those people, you have to dig a little bit deeper to be able to recognize the human value. So I think what I see in that is there are certain people it's easier to jump into a ring for, just based on, our own human condition of being ready to judge. And then there are other people that we've decided are lower on the hierarchy of human value. And so it's a much bigger risk to say that their lives are worth fighting for, or worth putting in my tax dollars for, or worth getting into a room with officials for. Right. So To me, that's been pretty clear in seeing how people are hesitant. And I think a lot of it comes back to racism as well. There are people of certain colors that we're willing to jump into a ring for, and then people of other colors, like, let's just call it what it is, like white people versus black and brown people. I think it's pretty clear to me that we've decided as a church even that there are some lives that matter more than others, and it's a big issue, and it's something we don't talk about in the Roman Catholic Church, at least. Racism has been a huge issue that we've actually been complicit in when we look at our structures and our hierarchy and contributed to. And, there have been some minimal efforts to at least acknowledge it, but there's still a lot of work to do. And, now it's just part of our institution, so we don't necessarily see it or talk about it, but it's totally there.
I think, like all things written into the laws founding our country, is they're written intentionally to be vague. And so this debate that we constantly have been having since religion and country met, it is, the debate of separation of church and state. What exactly does that mean? Everybody asked that question, and nobody has the answer. That's why we have to take everything piece by piece. That's why we have to take everything in its context and see, well, should we have separation of church and state in this scenario? Well, what about this scenario? Well, what about when it affects my money? Well, what about when it affects the money that, the church is given by private individuals, and then the church can give to people running for political office? There's so many different scenarios that people haven't even thought of yet, and we have to just take it case by case, because that separation of church and state that everybody loves to talk about so much, nobody exactly knows what it means. And both church and state are part of one thing called society, and they're inseparable because they're joined by that one yoke that is society.
Right. Well, and it's interesting to me, too, when a lot of people go back to, like, nowadays we're having all these political conversations, and people are talking a lot about the Constitution, which, there's some good stuff in there. I'm a fan of, like, the First and Fourth Amendments, like, great stuff. But we also have to recognize it was written by white men. And, like, within the original Constitution, there was a line that said that blacks were 3/5 of a person. And, the majority of the people who wrote the Constitution also owned slaves. So, like, that's inherent in that document. Like, that's not something that we can ever parse or separate out, as much as we add amendments and try to change things. So it's like, we're really fooling ourselves if we believe that we can separate the situation and the context and the writers of the Constitution from the implications for our country.
I'm interested in, as a, I'll go ahead and say it, a very devout Catholic. Would you agree with that?
I would.
As a very devout Catholic, what is your... so tithing is a really controversial topic among non-Catholics versus Catholics. And that's one of the sundry list of things that made me a little cold to the Catholic Church, is this sort of obligation to give, what is it 10% of your 10% of your wages to the church. And that's one of the things that I think is exactly contrary, like Jonathan was saying, to the Bible passage, render unto Caesar what is his, and render unto God what is his. So I understand I understand that to run a church and to make a community and to build buildings and to have structures and places of worship for people, you got to have money, of course. But also, then why do so many Catholics fall back onto that? Well, like, God doesn't have anything to do with money kind of thing. Can you shed some light on that, or can you give your opinion at least?
Yeah, tithing is particularly interesting for me because I take a vow of poverty, and so the way that so we have almost this like alternative economy that's set up. You might say it borders on communism in some ways, but really what happens is when I get a paycheck, it goes into the common fund that we have as Sisters of Providence, and then I budget out what I need, or what we need as a house. We make a house budget every year, and so that includes like food, supplies, rent. We have like a list of things that we would ask for money for. And so it is interesting for me because there's also some baggage for us as women religious, because for many, many years, women religious basically staffed schools and hospitals with very minimal compensation. So in a way, I feel like we're still getting back some of the resources that were kept from us. So that makes it hard for me to sort of decide or understand what I feel called to give. So, and then it's also like, I feel like we're just in a whole different category because we give to the church in lots of ways. So just like being present, the resources we offer, I'm training leaders in Catholic churches. So all of those things make it really complex for me to be able to decide what is reasonable tithe for me when I'm actually turning in my entire paycheck.
Right, I think
so
for you, you're
that makes it a
definitely
little
giving
bit
more
different.
than 10% of your wages. You're giving both your time and your talent, well, all three, time, talent, and treasure to the church. And for the layman Catholic churchgoer who, maybe only makes $30,000 or $40,000 a year, to give 10% of his paycheck, to be mandated to give 10% of his paycheck to the church is probably very stressful. And I don't personally think that it's a decision that the church should make. I think if John Q. Churchgoer wants to give 11% or if he wants to give only 3%, I think that should just be up to him, and it shouldn't be a law in the Catholic club that says this is the number. So what?
Yeah. And I have to be honest, I don't actually know where that mandate comes from. So I'd be interested to research, because there are a lot of false understandings in the church that certain things are infallible doctrine when actually it's just one pope said it one time and everybody decided so there's actually very few things in the Catholic Church that have been spoken on infallibly, but so if a pope is going to say something that's this is the real deal, we're all going to believe this, it's very, very rare for that to happen. So I'd be curious to go back and see where that mandate was actually made, if it was actually something that was said by a pope infallibly, or if it's just something that's been part of the Catholic guilt culture. Because I guess it's not something that I take as necessarily a mandate from the church at large, but I honestly don't know the history of where that's come from. And I also feel like I've heard recently, I don't know if it was Pope Francis or another just influential person in the hierarchy who spoke and was asking people not to tithe at such high levels because of the poverty they were seeing in that particular community, and recognizing that these families, there was this level of faith that was abandoning their own needs, which can be powerful, but they were recognizing at the same time that your family's actually not eating and this is not okay. So I don't see it as much of a hard and fast rule as it sounds like you're talking about it. And I think maybe that's because I just honestly, it's not something that I have focused on. And I think it's we could think about this 10% as being not just treasure. We could think about the 10% as being time, talent, and treasure. So people who, are not able to give so much in the area of treasure, maybe they can give more of their time and talent. So I
like that.
And I mean, that could just be more of a personal spiritual approach to it, but
no, I like that. I think that's a good, nice way of looking at it. It's really hard for some people to live on only 90% of their earnings, especially when they can be so low already. Jonathan, in your church, is there a either de facto or de jure amount of money that you're supposed to give to the church, or is it just sort of whatever you can?
Yeah, it's Protestants tithe too, so it's all across Christianity. And in Islam, there's I think it's 15% of your, one of the pillars of the faith, the 5 pillars, is 15% of your stuff at the end of the year, I think. So, I mean, it's all churches, or all kinds of churches do it. And I think it is just kind of a baseline, hey, help your religious institution continue to exist. It's when you go to Wikipedia and it's hey, if you enjoy using Wikipedia, consider donating $3. And,
right.
You heard it here first, everybody. Church is like Wikipedia.
So, but it's similar. I mean, I know a lot of people that don't tithe. I've tithed intermittently, if at all, for a lot of my life. But there's 2 passages I'm thinking of right now, and I think it's because there's the one where Jesus describes a woman coming into the synagogue, and she's dirt poor. She can't, she's obviously not thriving financially. So and she comes in and she gives just a little tuppence or whatever. Tuppence is an old
I don't
British
think they
thing,
had tuppence in Jesus' time, in Jesus' area.
She had a hay penny.
One straw penny.
She gave a little hay penny to the thing. Right?
A whole straw penny?
But no, she gave just what she had. And Jesus is like, check it out, that's the best thing you could possibly give. Her tuppence or halfpenny or denarii? No, that's even after Jesus too. I don't know what the coins were.
The Caesar coin.
But whatever like minuscule offering she had was worth so much more than like the 10,000 whatever that someone else would offer. And the other passage that I think of is when Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, if the Roman soldier asks you to carry their things for a mile, Jesus said, carry their things for not 1 mile but 2. Then that's where go the extra mile comes from.
Turn the other cheek kind of thing.
Exactly. That's like literally right after that he said that thing too.
That's my favorite. So that's my favorite line from the Weird Al song "Amish Paradise."
Oh yeah, I just smile at it. Yeah. So that's exactly. And I think Weird Al's getting to the heart of what lies at the gospel message really. Sister Tracey just came back, so I wanted that to be the returning line. But I don't.
We really strayed from the conversation. We're talking about Weird Al.
Not really. Yeah, a little bit, but
Weird Al.
Yeah, but no, I think looking at it that way, it's not about how many miles you go. It's about where your heart is and why you're doing it. Are you doing it because this Roman soldier says, like, hey, carry my things for a mile? Are you doing it because you love your enemy and because you're here to have, like, a life of devotion and discipleship? And so looking at that with the tithing and with the woman who donated what little she had, I mean, obviously on that one level, it is a very practical thing where to make the church exist, it needs money. Right. But I think what matters more, and going back to the time and talent thing too, it's just offering what you can to support God's ministry through or for the church and however you can. I think that's what matters. And that's, I think, where a lot of, at least in the Protestant church or at least in the PCUSA, that's where a lot of the emphasis lies.
Yeah, and I think another thing that comes to mind for me is, like, what's your definition of church? So, like, for me, the Catholic Church is actually the people of God. So if there's somebody that I know who, like, is in need and I, loan them $20 or whatever, like, that's actually tithing. If they're, if there's work that I'm doing outside of my paid ministry that is feeding someone in a spiritual way or that is building up the people of God, that could actually be tithing. So I think I don't think it needs to be defined as narrowly as, like, what you literally physically put in the basket on Sunday. But I think that also requires, like, an understanding of the church as the people of God, which I think for a lot of people is a little bit outside the realm of what they know.
Right. I was actually going to ask, how would you define people of God? Would that be like everyone? Or would that be Christians or just people of some sort of religious faith?
For me, the people of God would be everyone.
Word. Same.
Yeah. So I don't really have anything else to say about that.
Yeah. No, I like that.
I think most good Christians would have a hard time debating against that.
I
don't know. I feel like a lot of people would say people of God is like just the Christians. The whole, like.
Well, those people.
Somehow we've inherited the Jewish chosen people thing. I don't know where where you can get the idea that that's our thing now.
Those people have not.
I don't know. I know people.
Those people have not read their scripture. They have not read the Bible. Then that's like the one thing that Jesus is saying all the time is it doesn't matter who you are. Just be nice, dude. Jeez.
Well, and a lot of people would also argue, like, there are people who think Jesus was a Christian.
I know, that's
right.
Like, Jesus was Jewish.
Jesus was a white conservative
Christian. He was a Jew
who loved America.
He actually doesn't, like, if you read and actually see the things that he says, it's not like he was like, okay, people, time to build this new church of me. Like, he doesn't actually say that. So it's really interesting to me when I talk to people and I'm like, Jesus was Jewish, right? And they're just all confused and shocked and like their mind was just blown and they don't know, they can't sleep at night.
That's how I was a couple weeks ago. I think Jonathan revealed to me that VeggieTales was Jewish and not Christian, which I had always just grown up thinking that it was Christian.
VeggieTales?
Wow, I didn't know that either, actually.
They only cover Old Testament
VeggieTales
stuff.
is totally Christian.
Yeah.
Really?
Was it not you who told me this?
No way.
I think you just rocked Jonathan's world, actually.
Yeah,
I thought
we might need a
Jonathan rocked
minute.
my world the other week. Maybe I was wrong,
Not
but they only cover Old Testament stuff, and you can watch all the episodes and remind yourself of that if you need to. But the writers...
No, Good Samaritan. Sorry? The one town has the pots on their head, one town has the shoes on their head. That's the Good Samaritan. That's
I don't
Luke
think
10.
it is. Is it?
For sure it is. Because he gets mugged in the street, and the person from the other village comes. That's directly.
Is that New Testament then?
Luke 10, yeah.
Okay, well, They could be New Testament, but I know for sure that the writers of VeggieTales and the sentiment behind VeggieTales is to convey Old Testament and Jewish values, which it just so happens that Jewish values and Christian values are really, really similar. So it works for many people of many faiths.
Same
just so
Bible.
Happens, just so happens for a pretty specific reason. So, community organizer, bringing it all back. You wanted to talk?
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because, like, one of the big issues that a lot of community organizers are dealing with right now in our network, too, of faith-based organizing is, like, okay, you have, since, like, the election, we've had, like, thousands and millions of people flooding streets and, like, coming into these movements, like, wanting to do something, which is great, except they're all, like, untrained and like just and are coming from totally different contexts. So the work of community organizing it's actually a long haul. Like it doesn't mean just showing up with a sign. It actually means like being able to tell your own story in a context and being able to connect to like the deeper values that we hold underneath of that and how that connects to other people's deeper values. And you, like, can't do that in a crowd of, like, 5,000 where you're just, like, yelling and holding signs and stuff. So that's been something that we've really struggled with. But it's also, like, I think one reason that faith-based organizing can be so powerful and so successful is that you're working from within, like, a common context. So for people who all attend, like, one church and one physical location over years, there are like these deeper relationships that have happened and this common sense of understanding to draw from when you're creating these conversations. So it's really like, I don't know, right now I feel like we in some ways have like not known what to do with all of these other folks who are coming out of the woodwork because they a lot of times don't have that groundedness in common experience and common values. So it makes it harder to create this collective movement. Yeah, so that's
it seems like there's a lot of passion with little direction lately.
Yes.
And you know, one of those things is great, but you got to have two to really succeed. There's just you know, there's problems all the time, but now seemingly more than ever, especially with communication being what it is and being so fast and so instant, and you know, everybody wants to be heard, and everybody wants to be a part of something big. They want to be a part of I'd say everybody wants to be a part of the right thing to do, don't you think? In their head, aren't they always doing the right thing?
Maybe. So this is something that's been really challenging to me, and we've been talking about. So on a local context, 3 weeks ago, Aaron Bailey, who was an unarmed black man, was pulled over by police, and as part of this traffic stop, he eventually drove away and was being followed by the police, and then ran into a tree. His airbag, what is it called? Deployed, thank you. And then he was shot 14 times in the back and killed. So we've been grappling, like, this has really shaken our community and brought the whole, like, police brutality issue has become really real and personal in Indianapolis. And it's been really painful and difficult because, you know, like, 3 months ago, there was a science march in Indianapolis and, like, 5,000 white women showed up. 2 weeks ago, we had a rally in support of Aaron Bailey. We had about 200 people. So it's like, clearly there's a disconnect between values, and it's almost to me like when you think about the Women's March or the Science March, it's just vague enough that people can get on board without risking their reputation, without risking that other people might question them or say like, oh, you know, or dismiss them. But you know, Aaron Bailey was a real person. You're
taking a real stance if you come to that 200 person parade, or not parade. What would you call it? Rally.
Gathering, rally.
Yeah, you're taking a real stance that you have to stand up for, and you have to be willing for your face to be part of that movement, and that's scary for many people.
Yeah, exactly. So So I think I'm seeing a real disconnect. So you might have people who say they want to do the right thing. And that's cool. But like, we've been talking a lot about base building and relationship and how, you know, you could have 100 friends who like you agree with and you have a lot of the same values. But if they're not willing to like take a risk or put themselves on the line for those values, that's not a movement. That's just a dinner party, you know? So it's really, it's a real challenge. And I think it's been interesting for me lately thinking about like asking this funny question of what would Jesus do. That sounds really cliche, but I watched something really interesting yesterday about the impact of satire and satirical newscasts. You think about people like Stephen Colbert and like The Daily Show and the impact that those have and the truth that they're able to tell, and contrasting that to like 24-hour news cycles. Mm-hmm. And the point that they made is that like these 24-hour news cycles who are like arguing and debating these ridiculous things, they're actually giving more credence to some of the things that, for example, Trump might say that are clearly lies that should be just dismissed and shouldn't be talked about for 24 hours.
Right.
But then you bring in somebody like Stephen Colbert, and what they're able to do is just tell the truth because it's like ridiculous. And so they can just point it out, and then they can actually and dismiss it in a really powerful way. But then again, what that does is it alienates the opposition. It actually alienates people who would want to defend that and be like, but you have to consider the circumstances, or, you know, maybe we'll get proof 2 weeks from now, and you know, we should just give them the benefit of the doubt, where somebody like Stephen Colbert would just say like, that's ridiculous. Like, yeah. let's make fun of this and move on and see like what are the actual facts here. So I wonder about this idea of Jesus as being like a comedic satirist. I don't know, because he uses so much irony, and he's not willing to compromise. So we've been talking a lot about messaging and about how there was this funny cartoon that I saw recently that was talking about like what would it look like to put images of compromise into these like historical images of confrontation. So it showed like a civil rights march where you had like the KKK on one side and you had like these amazing civil rights leaders on the other side, and it showed a person with a sign that said compromise like question mark in the middle, and you just see how ridiculous that is. Yeah. And it's like, you can't be nice, you can't say the nice thing if what you really want is change in the face of a dictator or a demagogue. Like, there's just no space for that. And I think Jesus can be a really strong model of, you know, he wasn't willing to put up with some of the ridiculous things that the Pharisees said. He just pointed out the ridiculousness in a way that nobody could really question. So I think about the scripture of where Jesus and the apostles were walking through a field and they were picking the heads of grain on the Sabbath. And so you have the Pharisees that are like, hold on a second, it's the Sabbath, you all know the rules. And then Jesus is like, so are you telling me that when the leader of the temple goes in and eats on the Sabbath or whatever piece of ritual they do, that traditionally like that would be against the law, but guess what, like they do it because it's like part of the ritual. So he just comes back in their face and says, you know, this has this great ironic response that they can't say anything to. So I don't know. I think some people are really hesitant to get to that level of speaking the truth because it's going to alienate some people who are supporting a demagogue right now and who aren't, they're not ready to actually take that step. As much as they would, you know, if a bunch of their friends go out and hold signs, like they can do that. But it's a different kind of risk. It's a different kind of commitment.
And that's I don't know, it's an interesting line to walk almost, because I think of it in terms of like the person who wrote that story about Jesus being grain on the Sabbath was a fan of Jesus, so it was easy for them to be like, and the Pharisees were like, whoa man, you know, but like if I came to like some alt-right rally and picked grain metaphorically and they were like, hey, you can't do that, and I were like, oh, but really, and pointing out why they're wrong, they wouldn't be like, wow, good point. They'd be like, they'd have a real response. And so That's one thing that I think about a lot in our current political climate is how do I engage fully with like struggling to actually stand up for something important and specifically engaging with people who disagree with me on that in a way that won't just further polarize them or create that enemy dynamic. Whether or not the enemy dynamic is a fair and accurate description of what's going on, how do I engage with them specifically in a way that will help them to turn around and see things the way that I see things, or at least to understand my perspective. Right. Rather than just for them to get angry about it. Because I think everyone just gets angry is the first reaction on either end of the spectrum right now.
Do you think that having rallies and having protests where it's just a mob of people, walking down a street in solidarity together, holding up signs, do you think that's a strong way to get your point across or to engage in, to begin that dialogue? Because I don't. I really don't. Yeah. I think protests are largely symbolic and they hardly ever accomplish what I think they want to. Because they never know who they're yelling at. It's just yelling into a void. And the people who want to hear that can be part of it, and the people who don't want to hear it can just turn off the TV or like shut their office window as the crowd walks by. And no real change is made. It's just a bunch of people feeling good about themselves together.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I don't think it's necessarily either or. I think it can be. I think it's fairly rare. I mean, we're having sort of like protest fatigue in our country right now. So to get attention and to get results, I think we have to be really strategic. But to give you an example, we had a public meeting for a city of inclusion back in February. And leading up to that, we had a series of meetings with the sheriff's office and the mayor's office with very specific asks and trying to get some information about where they stood on particularly dealing with ICE's interaction with our local jail. And so when we were forming the agenda team around that public meeting, we were very intentional about who would tell their stories and the perspectives that we wanted in the room and the tension that we were trying to create. And so then we also invited those public officials into the room. And so then it was like creating a moment of choice where, they knew there were going to be 2,000 people in a room. So they had to choose, like, are you going to show up and show concretely your stance? Or are you, like in this case, the sheriff chose not to attend, and that made a statement about where he was. So I think if done well, then public events like that, they can show the power of people, like how many people actually stand with this. So when you're thinking about election time or, public officials are moved by numbers. So that's something that they have to consider. And it also, it creates a moment of tension and choice. So like we think about commitment and, like for me, when I stood up a few weeks ago and took my vows, it had a particular meaning because it was in front of hundreds of people. So now it's like, oh, I have to be accountable to all of these people. All of these people know that I said this thing. And so later,
streaming it online.
Right, that's true. And so then later they can come back and be like, remember when you said you took the vow of poverty? Like, hey, what's this about? How'd you get this Mercedes? And so like, so similarly, like with elected officials, if they stand up in front of 2,000 people and say something, it's a lot different than saying something in a room of like 10 people. So then it's like, it's not so much about, like the event is important because it creates the tension and it forces a choice. And it's demonstrating the power of the people. But even more important than that is like the follow-up that happens. So after that event, we continued to have negotiations behind the scenes with these elected officials and to say like, hey, remember when you said you're not going to spend one dime of local resources on unconstitutional or discriminatory policies? Hey, this is actually unconstitutional what's happening in our jail. So that's like a piece of the puzzle. But I think a lot of people who are jumping into this work now don't understand that it's like, that's not like the main thing. Like it serves a purpose, but if there's not like the follow-up and negotiation, and if there's not that really intentional, like if you don't have a specific ask for this gathering, then again, it's just like a larger outdoor sized dinner party of people who agree with each other.
And that's my main problem with so many of these protests. I liked your description of protest fatigue because I think that describes perfectly what I have been feeling in the past couple of years. I feel like you're right. They don't have a particular ask. It's just a bunch of people who are like, hey man, did you get the Facebook invite for the protest? Like, looks pretty cool. I care about the environment, don't you? Like, I care about women's rights. Yeah, everybody cares about the environment. Everybody cares about women. But like, you know, if you're just chanting in the streets together and not actually having a conversation afterwards, or you're not like walking with that crowd to a place to do something about it, then not a lot is being accomplished. It's just a lot of noise, and like I'd rather not hear it, because I know the noise is there, but if there's not, like you said, a specific ask, then it's just noise and nothing accomplished.
Well, what I would say, I don't know, not saying whether or not this is worth the cost of the fatigue and everything, because obviously there's a lot of things to be weighed there. But what I see as the merit to even those demonstrations where you are just screaming into the void is, and specifically, I like calling them demonstrations because that's where the value is to me. It's not the active protest or the action that's being taken politically there. It's the fact that you're demonstrating and reminding people in the public eye, like, this is something that's going on. This isn't normal. This isn't okay. It's just like your little obnoxious reminder that like something horrible is happening. Because especially as someone who's not affected by a lot of policies, it's easy to forget that these policies are taking place and that people are being hurt by them. So seeing these demonstrations, there's definitely ways that they're not being done well and ways that they need to improve. But I think even that, at its worst, has that merit that I think is incredibly valuable.
And I think I've seen some really creative, like, ways that people are moving into a more creative resistance that's really productive. So, like, when we think about Standing Rock, one of the powerful moments for me was when you had this group of white vets who came and stood on the front line. They actually put their bodies on the line in protection and solidarity with all of the Native Americans who had been there fighting and dealing with the tear gas and fire hoses. And it was just a blatant moment of showing that hierarchy of human value, because the police refused to like turn their hoses on these white vets. And so to me, that was like a creative way of sending a message that was really, really clear. There's actually a religious community, I can't remember where they're based, it might be in Pennsylvania, that recently, as a way of protesting a pipeline on their land, they cleared this area that had been cropland and they created an outdoor chapel. And they started like holding prayer there, because now it's like, oh, well, if you're going to seize this land, you're actually going to be like destroying a chapel, and that looks really bad. So I think it's interesting. And I mean, recently with some of like the healthcare actions and die-ins, having people in wheelchairs who are on the front lines of those demonstrations, like it just creates a different kind of tension that carting those, I think there was a group of people who were actually carted away by police physically, like taken out of their wheelchairs. So when you see that like has a different visceral impact on the story and the way that like you just can't ignore that as easily.
You mean you equals the politician in this case?
I think so. And I think the general public, I think some people who are in the middle, like that are like, oh, I'm not ready to get off the sidelines and actually do something. Like if you see a person being dragged out of their wheelchair and you were kind of on the fence about healthcare, now you're like, okay, I can't, that might be something that would move you.
I feel like that's a good, we've been going for a pretty long time. Certainly if you have any other points, you've got lots of good things to say most of the time, so I don't want to cut you off at any point. It's good. But is there anything you wanted to, final statements or anything you wanted to plug for IndieCan, or I don't know if you're like writing a book. I'd read it if you are.
That's hilarious. No, I mean, I just like appreciate both of you, like your willingness to talk about this. And I think, obviously, like we've spent a lot of time on the faith aspect, but also recognizing that like there is this struggle, and especially among a lot of young people who don't feel compelled to go into a church right now. I think we have a lot of work to do. And so the fact that you two are facilitating this conversation, I think is really important. And it's humbling to me, because I think sometimes I do have like a fear of going into that realm. And, because this has been my life, and as a woman religious, like it's at the heart of my context. Like sometimes I don't even know how to interact with people who feel alienated from that. So this has been good for me just as a conversation. And I guess I would just encourage people. So IndieCan is part of PICO, which is a national network. We're actually in the rebranding process right now. We might be Faith in America or Faith Forward, but we have affiliates all over the country in 22 states. So I would just encourage folks, I don't know what the reach of your show is, but that's okay. But to just look into those and get involved. This is some of the most compelling work that I've seen as far as really developing leaders to respond to the moment that we're in, because it's going to take more than just showing up at a rally. It's going to take really diving into some of these uncomfortable conversations and just some of the critical thinking we've been doing today. So I think this is really important, and it's been fun to think about these things.
Yeah. You've been a great guest. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I've enjoyed having a third co-host here. And take it away.
So I have a poem.
I assume it's a poem that relates slightly
no,
to
not
what
at
we've
all.
been talking about. So I'm good for any. I'm
This
just gonna
is
say
totally
I'm good for just any cool
random.
poetry. But if it also has a tie-in with today's conversation, then that'd be dope.
Yeah, it does. So this, do you mind? Can I just go?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So this is from Julia Esquivel, who she's a Guatemalan poet. You should look her up. She's really interesting. But this is an excerpt from her poem, They Have Threatened Us with Resurrection. It isn't the noise in the streets that keeps us from resting, my friend, nor is it the shouts of the young people coming out drunk from the St. Paul, nor is it the tumult of those who pass by excitedly on their way to the mountains. It's something within us that doesn't let us sleep, that doesn't let us rest, that won't stop pounding deep inside. It's the silent, warm weeping of Indian women without their husbands. It's the sad gaze of the children fixed somewhere beyond memory, precious in our eyes, which during sleep, though closed, keep watch, systole, diastole, awake. They have threatened us with resurrection because they do not know life. That is the whirlwind which does not let us sleep. The reason why, sleeping, we keep watch, and awake, we dream. No, brother, it is not the noise in the streets which does not let us sleep. Join us in this vigil, and you will know what it is to dream. Then you will know how marvelous it is to live threatened with resurrection, to dream awake, to keep watch asleep, to live while dying, and to know ourselves already resurrected.